As usual, if you like these stories or it felt meaningful to you, feel free to like, share, and comment your thoughts below, as well as subscribe to our channel. It could be a huge support for our work. Now, let's just enjoy the stories.
On the same autumn evening in the Hamptons, two worlds were about to collide. A woman, 8 months pregnant, stood before a towering iron gate, her hands trembling from the late autumn chill, with exactly $47 left in her pocket. 48 hours ago, she had a job, an apartment, and a man who promised to marry her. Now she had nothing except the baby kicking softly inside her and an address her father had scrawled in his final letter before he died. She didn't know where she would sleep tonight if this door didn't open. Less than 100 meters away, a man stood by a second-floor window, slowly swirling an amber glass of whiskey, his steel-cold gaze following the silhouette of the stranger outside the gate. Minutes earlier, he had signed a verdict not the kind found in courtrooms, but the kind that ensured his business rival would never be seen in this city again. He was Sterling Blackwell, heir to the most powerful underground empire on the East Coast. And he was wondering why his grandmother, the only woman in this world he never refused, had invited a ragged stranger into their home. She didn't know she was stepping into the devil's domain, and he didn't know that the woman standing outside that gate would become the only thing he couldn't control, and the only thing he'd burn the whole world down to protect. This is the story of a woman abandoned by the world, and a mafia boss who had never known what love was, until they met. If you want to know what happens when she walks through that gate, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. A like and share from you will help this story reach more people. Now, let's begin. The iron gate began to move before Wren could even find the bell. The metal scraped softly against itself like a greeting from a distance, and she stood there, her heart pounding, watching the two enormous gates slowly part to reveal the stone path leading toward the vast mansion ahead. Someone had known she was coming. Someone had been waiting. The thought brought her relief and sent a shiver through her at the same time. Wren drew in a long breath, tightened her grip on the handle of her worn old suitcase, and took her first steps inside. The road was longer than she had imagined. On either side stood rows of ancient oak trees, still as silent sentries, their red and gold autumn leaves scattered across the damp ground. The farther she walked, the more the noise of the outside world fell away, replaced by a heavy stillness unlike anything she had ever known. Not the peace of an ordinary home, the silence of power. When she neared the front entrance, a figure was already waiting on the white marble steps, Eleanor Blackwell. The woman looked older than Wren had imagined, and far more commanding. Her silver-white hair was cut short and neatly arranged, every strand so carefully kept, it was as though time itself wouldn't dare touch her without permission. Her posture was straight as a pine, though her right hand rested lightly on a cane topped with silver. But what made Wren stop were her eyes, blue like the sea after a storm, sharp enough to see through every lie, yet with something warm buried deep inside them, like embers still glowing beneath cold ash. Eleanor didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why she had come, didn't ask about the man who had abandoned her, or about the 8-month child swelling beneath her thin coat. She only looked at her for a long moment, then said in a low, velvet, warm voice, "You made it here. Come inside." It must have been a tiring journey. 4 simple words. Yet they were 4 words that, in the past 48 hours, no one had said to her. Wren felt her throat tighten, but she swallowed it down. She had cried too much already. There were no tears left to fall. She nodded and followed Eleanor through the enormous oak doors, and the world inside stole a breath from her chest. The main hall of the Blackwell mansion was as large as the studio apartment she had once rented in Manhattan. A crystal chandelier hung high above, thousands of glass pieces casting warm golden light across the cream-colored marble floor. The scent of old oak, expensive perfume, and something else she couldn't name, perhaps the smell of money and power, blended together into an air so dense it seemed almost tangible. Wren walked as if in a dream, her worn flat shoes tapping softly against the stone, the sound strangely out of place amid such luxury. She didn't belong here. Everything in her cried that truth aloud, but she had nowhere else to go. Eleanor led her down a long corridor lined with oil paintings, portraits of people Wren guessed were Blackwell ancestors. As she walked, she spoke in a voice that was gentle but clear. "Your father was a good man." She didn't turn to look at Wren. 25 years ago, He was the lawyer who helped me when no one else dared stand by my side. He didn't ask who I was, didn't ask what I had done to earn enemies. He simply did what needed to be done. She stopped before a door and turned to face Ren. Now it's my turn to repay that debt. Ren wanted to say something, wanted to thank her, wanted to ask why she was willing to open her door to a ragged stranger like her, but her throat was dry and bitter, and all she could do was nod, hoping her eyes could carry the gratitude words couldn't express. Neither woman realized that from the second-floor balcony, a pair of steel-blue eyes was watching them. Sterling stood in the shadows, his back against the railing, one hand still holding a whiskey glass already half empty. He watched his grandmother lead the strange woman down the corridor, watched the way she moved slowly beneath the weight of her belly, watched the way her gaze kept flicking around, as if she were a young doe that had wandered into a wolf's territory. He didn't know who she was. He didn't care. But there was something in the way she tried to stand straight when she was clearly exhausted. Something in those narrow shoulders trembling beneath the thin coat that kept him from looking away. Then he clicked his tongue, turned his back, and disappeared into the darkness of the upper hallway. A ragged stranger wasn't worth his attention. He had more important matters to worry about. Eleanor stopped before a room at the end of the eastern corridor and pushed the door open. "This will be your room. Rest. We'll talk more in the morning." Then she turned away, the light tap of her cane against the wooden floor fading into the distance, leaving Ren alone. The room was larger than her old apartment. A four-poster bed draped with deep jade velvet, a large window looking out over the darkened garden, a fireplace crackling softly in the corner, releasing a gentle warmth. On the bedside table, someone had already set out a tray of tea and several biscuits. Ren placed her suitcase on the floor, walked to the center of the room, and stood there. She didn't know whether to cry from relief or laugh at the absurdity of it all. 48 hours ago, she had thought her life was over. Now she was standing in a room beautiful enough to belong in a palace, inside the home of a family she had never heard of, welcomed by a woman she had never met. The baby inside her gave a small kick, as if reminding her that no matter how mad the world became, there was still a reason to keep going. Ren laid a hand over her belly and whispered, "I don't know what this place is, but at least tonight, we have somewhere to sleep." Outside the window, the moon was beginning to rise over the horizon, spilling silver light across the vast garden. And somewhere in that mansion, a man sat in the dark, wondering why he still couldn't drive the image of the strange woman's eyes from his mind. An hour after Ren had changed into the clean clothes someone had already placed in the wardrobe, there came a soft knock at the door. A maid in a proper black and white uniform stood outside, bowed her head politely, and informed her that dinner had been served and Mrs. Eleanor was inviting her downstairs to the dining room. Ren followed the maid through long, endless corridors, trying to remember the way, but she quickly gave up because the mansion was like a maze, with countless doors shut in silence and unexpected turns at every corner. The dining room lay in the western wing of the house, large enough to host a dinner for 50 people. But tonight, only 3 people sat around the long oak table, and the distance between them made Ren feel as though she were sitting in an abandoned church rather than at a family meal. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, a glass of red wine in hand, and nodded in greeting when Ren stepped inside. And on the opposite side, 4 empty chairs away from her, was the man Ren had caught sight of through the window that afternoon. Sterling Blackwell. He didn't rise when she entered, didn't greet her. He didn't even lift his head to look at her. He simply sat there, his back straight as a blade, holding knife and fork as he cut the piece of steak on his plate with the cold precision of a surgeon. Ren sat in the chair the maid pulled out for her, feeling smaller and more out of place than ever. She tried to eat, but her throat tightened beneath the heavy silence hanging over the room. Eleanor occasionally asked a few polite questions, whether the journey had been tiring, whether the room was comfortable, but Sterling never opened his mouth. He finished before the 2 women, set his knife and fork down with a faint clink, then rose and walked out of the room without a word. Not even a nod. Eleanor watched her grandson's back disappear beyond the door, then turned to Ren with a faint smile touched by apology. "My grandson isn't used to having strangers in the house," she said, her voice as calm as if she were commenting on the weather. "Don't mind him." Ren nodded, not knowing what she ought to say. She finished the rest of dinner in silence, then asked permission to return to her room early. But when she lay down on the softest bed she had ever been allowed to sleep in, sleep wouldn't come. She tossed and turned for hours, staring up at the soaring ceiling with its intricate carved patterns, listening to the wind whistling softly outside the window. Her mind spun with hundreds of questions that had no answers. At last, she got up, pulled on a thin wool sweater, and stepped out onto the balcony. The garden at night stretched beneath her like a black velvet carpet touched here and there by silver moonlight. Thin mist crawled up from the ground, curling around the trunks of trees and the rose bushes that had already withered, creating a scene that felt both enchanted and strangely lonely. And in the middle of it, a figure was moving slowly along the stone path. Sterling. He walked alone, with no lamp, no coat, even though the autumn night was bitter cold. His stride wasn't hurried, but it wasn't relaxed either. It was the walk of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Wren stood there, watching him from above, and for the first time she realized something strange. This man had everything. A vast mansion, power that commanded the respect of an entire city, wealth beyond anything she could imagine. But he looked lonelier than anyone she had ever met. Lonely in the way of a king sitting on his throne in an empty palace, with no one to speak to and no one to trust. She had lost everything and felt alone. He had everything, and was no less alone. That realization stirred something strange inside her. Not pity. Sterling Blackwell wasn't the sort of man who needed anyone's pity. It was a quiet understanding instead, the kind that appears only between souls that have already been beaten down by life. The baby in her belly chose that moment to give a hard kick, pulling her back to the present. Wren placed a hand over her stomach and rubbed small circles as though soothing the child not yet born. "I will protect you," she whispered, her voice only loud enough for herself to hear. "No matter what I have to do, whether this place is heaven or hell, whether the man down there is a devil or a saint, I will do whatever it takes to keep my child safe." That was the only promise she still had the power to keep. She turned and went back into the room, closed the balcony door, and this time, when she lay down on the bed, the exhaustion that had built over the past 48 hours finally pulled her into sleep. For the first time in weeks, she didn't dream of Garrett with his false smile and hollow promises. Didn't dream of her mother with her cold eyes and the words, "You brought this on yourself." That night, Wren slept without dreams. And when the first light of morning slipped through the gap in the curtains and woke her with its gentle warmth, she knew that even though she still understood nothing about this place, even though she still had no idea what the future would bring, at least she had survived one more night. And that alone was already a victory. The next morning, Eleanor knocked on Wren's door when the sun had risen about a hand's breadth into the sky. She stood there with her familiar, silver-handled cane, smiling as though she had already known Wren would wake at exactly this hour. "Come with me. There's something I want to show you." Wren followed Eleanor through hallways that felt less foreign than they had the night before, down the staircase, then into a rear wing of the house she had never set foot in. They stopped in front of a room much smaller than the others in the mansion, yet fully furnished with a walnut desk, bookshelves that reached all the way to the ceiling, and a large window overlooking the rose garden waiting for spring. "This is the office of the Blackwell Foundation, the family's charitable trust," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the stacks of files and ledgers arranged neatly on the desk. "The previous manager just left. I need someone to review the donation records and the financial reports. You used to be an accountant, didn't you?" Wren nodded, her heart beating a little faster. She didn't know how Eleanor knew that, but she had already learned that this woman seemed to know everything without ever having to ask. "Then this work suits you," Eleanor said, in a tone that wasn't quite an offer so much as a certainty. She said nothing more about salary or working conditions, and Wren didn't ask. She only knew that this was her chance to prove she wasn't a burden, wasn't a stray living on someone else's charity. On the first day, Wren sat at the desk with a mixture of uncertainty and nervous anticipation. She opened each ledger, read each line of figures, and little by little, something familiar began to wake inside her. This was the kind of work she was good at. Numbers, reports, balance sheets. They didn't betray her the way Garrett had. They didn't cast her out the way her old company had. They were simply numbers, honest and clear, waiting for her to put them in the right place. On the second day, Wren began to forget that she was 8 months pregnant in a house full of strangers. On the third day, she even forgot the ache of betrayal, still smoldering in her chest. Work became the best anesthetic she had ever known. Whenever her mind tried to wander back toward painful memories, she fixed her attention on the computer screen, on the figures that needed to be reconciled, on the reports that needed to be completed. And slowly, she began to feel like a person of worth, not a failure running from her own life. One afternoon at the end of that first week, while Wren was bent over checking a complicated spreadsheet, she didn't realize someone was standing in the doorway. Sterling stopped at the threshold of the office, one hand in his pocket, his expression cold as always, though his brow tightened slightly when he looked at the woman working inside. She didn't hear him arrive. She was too absorbed in the screen, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard, her eyes bright with a concentration he rarely saw in anyone. He stood there for a few seconds, longer than he had intended. Then he turned away and continued down the corridor without a word. Wren had no idea he had been there. She didn't know that something in him had already taken notice of her presence, though he himself didn't understand what it was. By the weekend, once Wren had grown used to the rhythm of her new work, she began to notice something strange. Some of the expenses didn't match the reports. The figures written in the ledgers didn't line up with what appeared in the system. There were large donations recorded as having been transferred out, but when she traced them, they disappeared into accounts she couldn't verify. Wren sat back and stared at the computer screen, her brow furrowing. Maybe she was mistaken. Maybe this was only a recording error left behind by the previous manager. But the instincts of an accountant who had spent 5 years in finance told her this wasn't a simple mistake. This was the sign of something far more serious. She looked out the window, where the evening shadows were gradually settling over the garden. She was only a stranger who had just arrived. Should she get involved in this? What right did she have? But then she thought of Eleanor, the woman who had opened her door when the rest of the world had slammed theirs shut. If someone was stealing money from her charitable foundation, Wren couldn't stay silent. She wouldn't allow herself to stay silent. She turned back to the screen, opened a new spreadsheet, and began noting down every irregular detail. She would find the truth, whatever that truth might be. That night, Wren didn't sleep. She sat in the small office, the desk lamp the only source of light in the darkened room, her fingers tapping constantly over the keyboard, while her eyes chased one line of figures after another across the screen. The baby in her belly had long since fallen asleep, but she couldn't stop. The deeper she dug, the more irregularities she found. Large donations from benefactors had been fully recorded in the ledgers. But when she matched them against the bank accounts, the amount actually received was far lower. The missing difference hadn't simply vanished. It had been moved out systematically through a chain of complicated transactions, a little at a time, each transfer passing through a different intermediary account, before finally ending up in overseas accounts Wren couldn't access. $2,300,000. That was the number she arrived at after tracing the pattern for 6 straight hours. $2,300,000 had evaporated from the Blackwell Foundation over the past 3 years without anyone knowing, and every one of those transactions had been approved by a single person. Mr. Morrison, the senior financial manager who had worked for the Blackwell family for 12 years. Wren leaned back in her chair, staring at that name on the screen, her heart racing wildly. 12 years. Long enough to build absolute trust. Long enough that no one would suspect a thing. And she, a newcomer who had been here less than 2 weeks, had just uncovered what an entire powerful family had never noticed. Who would believe her? The thought made Wren want to close the computer and pretend she had seen nothing. She was only a pregnant woman living on someone else's kindness, a dependent with no standing in this house. If she was wrong, she would be thrown out. If she was right but no one believed her, she would still be thrown out. Either way, she was staking everything she had on one decision. But then she thought of Eleanor, the woman who had opened her door without asking a single question, the woman who had spoken of Wren's father with a respect Wren had never heard from anyone after he died. If someone was deceiving her, stealing from the charitable foundation she had built, Wren couldn't stay silent. At the very least, she owed her the truth. The next morning, Wren stood outside Eleanor's room with a thick file in her hands, and a heart pounding so hard it felt ready to burst from her chest. Eleanor invited her in, looked at the file with quiet curiosity, then listened in silence as Wren laid out each of her findings. She spoke slowly and clearly, pointing to every figure, every transaction, every trail she had followed. She didn't accuse. She simply presented the facts and let Eleanor draw her own conclusion. When Wren finished, Eleanor said nothing for such a long moment that Wren began to fear she had made a terrible mistake. Then, Eleanor picked up the telephone on her desk, dialed a number, and said only 4 words. "Sterling, come in here." Less than 2 minutes later, the door opened and Sterling walked in. He was wearing black as always, his hair slicked neatly back, his eyes sweeping the room before stopping on Wren with a flicker of surprise that vanished almost at once. "Read this." Eleanor pushed the file toward her grandson. Sterling took it, and for the next 15 minutes he read every page, every figure, missing not a single detail. Wren stood there without daring to move, feeling as though she were being judged by a magistrate whose verdict could alter the course of her entire life. When Sterling finished, he didn't set the file down right away. He kept it in his hand, his thumb brushing lightly along the edge of the papers as though he were thinking through something very deeply. Then he lifted his head, and for the first time since Wren had set foot in this house, he truly looked at her, not the cold passing glance of before. A real look, as though he were reassessing everything he thought he knew about the woman standing in front of him. "She has eyes that see through things," Sterling said, his voice low and slow, as though he were speaking to Eleanor, and barely aware Wren was even there. "We worked with Morrison for 12 years and no one found it. She arrived less than 2 weeks ago and uncovered the whole thing." Eleanor smiled, and her gaze softened as she looked at Wren. "Just like her father was," she said gently. He could also see the things other people tried to hide. Wren didn't know what she should say. She stood there, feeling her cheeks grow warm at the unexpected praise, but also feeling an invisible weight lift from her shoulders. She had done the right thing. They believed her. Sterling folded the file shut, rose to his feet, and walked out of the room without another word. But before the door closed, he paused, turned his head, and looked back at Wren over his shoulder. "Thank you." His voice was brief and spare, and then he was gone. The next day, Mr. Morrison no longer appeared anywhere on the estate. There was no announcement, no explanation. No one spoke his name as though he had never existed at all. Wren looked at his empty desk in passing, and understood that in this place there were questions better left unasked. There were answers she shouldn't know, and there were boundaries that, if she were wise, she would never cross. On the same day Mr. Morrison vanished, Sterling called Pierce into his private study. The room was on the second floor of the eastern wing, a place almost no one was allowed to enter without a direct order from its master. Pierce stood before the desk, his back straight as a soldier awaiting instructions, while Sterling sat turning a fountain pen between his fingers, his eyes fixed on the window as though he were thinking about something far away. "The woman staying in the east wing, Wren Hartley," Sterling said, his voice flat and unreadable as always. "Make sure she has everything she needs. Food, supplies, whatever she requires for the pregnancy. Arrange a car to take her to her regular appointments." Pierce nodded, but before he could turn to leave, Sterling added, "And don't let her know these orders came from me. If she asks, tell her it's a state policy." Pierce didn't ask why. He had worked for Sterling long enough to know there were questions that oughtn't to be spoken aloud. He only nodded once more and left, leaving Sterling alone in a room flooded with afternoon light and yet strangely cold. In the days that followed, Wren began to notice small changes in her life on the estate. Breakfast brought to her room now always included fresh milk and seasonal fruit, the very things doctors recommended for pregnant women. In her office, a small heater appeared from nowhere beside her desk, keeping her feet warm during the crisp autumn days. And whenever it was time for one of her prenatal checkups, a gleaming black car was already waiting outside, the driver opening the door with quiet courtesy before she ever had to ask. Wren couldn't understand where these changes were coming from. She asked Eleanor during afternoon tea one day, and the older woman only gave her a mysterious smile, her eyes shining as though holding on to some private amusement. "This estate has its own way of taking care of its people," she said gently, then moved to another subject without offering any further explanation. Wren didn't ask again, but somewhere inside her, a seed of curiosity had been planted. On the afternoon of the third weekend since her arrival, Wren found herself in the estate library. The great room, with its shelves climbing all the way to the ceiling, had quickly become her favorite place, a quiet refuge in the middle of the vast mansion. She was sitting in an armchair by the window, an old novel in her hands, when the sound of footsteps behind her made her turn in surprise. Sterling stood in the doorway, as though he had just arrived or had been standing there for some time without her noticing. The moment their eyes met, both of them fell silent in an awkwardness neither of them could quite explain. Wren was about to stand, but Sterling stepped inside before she could move. He walked to the bookcase opposite her, his fingers brushing along the spines as though he were looking for something, though Wren had the distinct feeling he wasn't really searching for a book at all. "Your report?" Sterling said suddenly, his voice low and even, without turning to face her. Well done. Wren blinked, needing a moment to absorb that rare scrap of praise. I was only doing my job, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Sterling turned then and looked directly at her, his eyes holding something she couldn't read. Not many people would dare report a man who has been here for 12 years, he said. You could have stayed quiet, pretended you saw nothing, and life would have been much easier. Wren laid the book across her lap and met his gaze without blinking. Right is right, wrong is wrong, she said slowly, but clearly. Time doesn't change that. 12 years or 12 days, the truth is still the truth. The room fell silent. Sterling looked at her, and this time the look lasted longer than usual, as though he were reconsidering every judgment he had ever made about the woman sitting before him. Then he nodded, a small gesture, but one that carried a recognition Wren hadn't realized she wanted so badly. He turned, walked toward the door, and disappeared beyond the oak panels without another word. Wren kept looking after him until the door had closed completely. She realized that for the first time since she had entered this house, she was no longer afraid of that man. Not afraid of his cold gaze, not afraid of the heavy silence he carried with him. All she felt was curiosity. Curiosity about the real man behind that wall of ice. Curiosity about what had made him become this way. And perhaps, only a little, curiosity about why he cared enough to say those words to her at all. 1 week after the conversation in the library, just as Wren was beginning to settle into the new rhythm of life at Blackwell Estate, her past caught up with her in a way she had never expected. That morning began like any other. She was sitting in the small office, autumn sunlight streaming through the window and scattering warm gold across her desk, and she was reviewing the figures in the quarterly report when there came a knock at the door. Wren looked up, expecting to see one of the familiar household staff. But the man standing in the doorway wasn't anyone she had ever seen on the estate. He was middle-aged, with carefully groomed salt and pepper hair, dressed in an expensive gray suit with a navy silk tie. He carried a gleaming black leather briefcase and a smile so polished it felt immediately false. Wren recognized that kind of smile at once. It was the smile of lawyers paid very well to do the sort of work ordinary people would feel ashamed of. Miss Wren Hartley, he said, not as a question but as a statement, then stepped into the room without waiting to be invited. I am Martin Webb, legal representative for the Harrington family. I believe we have something to discuss. Wren felt as though her heart had been squeezed in a fist. Harrington. The name rang through her mind like an alarm bell, dragging behind it hundreds of memories she had tried to bury over the past weeks. Garrett Harrington. The man who had once promised to marry her, who had once said he loved her every night, then vanished like fog the moment she told him she was pregnant. How did you find me? Wren asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The lawyer smiled, the smile of a man holding the winning card. The Harrington family has the resources to find anyone they wish to find, Miss Hartley. But that isn't why I am here. He opened the leather briefcase, took out a thick stack of papers, and laid them on the desk in front of Wren. The Harrington family would like to resolve this matter quietly. $500,000 will be transferred into your account the moment you sign these documents. In exchange, you will waive any right to seek child support from Mr. Garrett Harrington and agree never to contact the Harrington family again. Wren looked at the papers as though they were a venomous snake. $500,000. It was more money than she would have dared dream of only a few weeks ago. Enough to solve every financial problem she had. Enough to give her a fresh start, a new life. But in exchange, she would be selling her child. This is a generous offer, Miss Hartley, the lawyer continued, his voice smooth as oil. The Harrington family is under no obligation to do this. They could choose other methods far less pleasant. You should think very carefully before refusing. Wren raised her eyes and met his gaze. Her hands were trembling beneath the desk, but her voice didn't waver in the slightest. This baby isn't a commodity to be bargained over, she said slowly, one word at a time. I don't need the Harrington family's money, and I don't need Garrett Harrington in my child's life. You should leave, and don't come back. The smile vanished from the lawyer's face, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. He rose to his feet and fastened the button of his suit jacket with deliberate slowness. You're making a mistake, Miss Hartley, he said, his tone still courteous, but with a sheet of ice beneath it. The Harrington family doesn't like being refused. He placed a business card on the desk beside the papers Wren refused to touch. When you change your mind, call me. But this offer won't remain forever. Then he turned and walked out of the room, the sound of his leather shoes striking the wooden floor in even measures, like an unspoken threat. When the door closed, Wren sat there alone in silence. Her hands began to shake more violently, and she had to grip the edge of the desk to keep herself from collapsing. Tears pressed against her eyes, but she bit down on her lip and refused to let herself cry. Not now. Not here. She didn't know how long Eleanor had been standing at the doorway. She didn't know Pierce had informed her the moment a stranger entered the estate. All she knew was that when she looked up, the older woman was already sitting beside her, her wrinkled but warm hands clasping Wren's trembling ones. Eleanor didn't say anything. She simply sat there, silent and patient, like a steadfast lighthouse in the middle of a storm. And it was that silence that broke the wall Wren had been building for weeks. She shattered. The tears came all at once, uncontrollable, and she began to tell everything. She told her about Garrett, about the 3 years they had spent together, about the promises and the nights she had believed she had found the man who would stay with her for the rest of her life. She told her about the moment she revealed the pregnancy and saw the look in his eyes change from love to fear and then to coldness. She told her about the unanswered messages, the calls he refused to take, and finally the short text he had sent, "Take care of it. Don't bother me." She told her about being pushed out of her job without proper cause, about losing her apartment when the landlord took it back, about her mother looking at her with disappointment and saying, "You brought this on yourself." She told everything, all of it, until there was nothing left to tell. Eleanor listened from beginning to end without interrupting. Only when Wren stopped, breathing hard with exhaustion, did she finally speak. "I know," she said gently. "I looked into you before you came here. I know about Garrett Harrington, about what he did, about his family." Wren lifted her head, stunned. "Why did you still take me in?" Eleanor smiled, and her hand tightened gently around Wren's. "Because you aren't like them. Because you are your father's daughter. And because I won't allow people like the Harrington family to think they can do whatever they please without paying for it." She rose to her feet, and the softness in her eyes gave way to something harder, sharper. "From now on, you don't need to worry about those people anymore," she said, her voice still gentle, but firm as steel. Then she walked out of the room, the silver cane striking a steady rhythm on the wooden floor as she made her way toward the eastern wing where Sterling's study was located. Wren watched her disappear around the corner of the hallway, and she knew something was about to change. She didn't know what it would be, but inside her chest, for the first time in a very long while, a small flicker of hope came to life. Maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face the ghosts of her past alone anymore. 2 weeks passed in a false kind of peace after the meeting with the Harrington family's lawyer. Wren tried to continue her work as though nothing had changed, tried to believe Eleanor when she said she didn't need to worry anymore. But deep down, she knew that people like the Harrington family never gave up easily, and she was right. That morning, when Wren stepped into the office, she saw a white envelope lying on her desk. There was no sender's name, only her own name printed neatly in bold black ink. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, and when she read the words inside, the world beneath her feet seemed to give way. It was a court summons. She was being sued for embezzling $2 million from her former company, where she had worked for 5 years before being dismissed without cause. The figures, the transactions, the accounts were laid out in chilling detail, as though someone had spent months constructing a flawless, false portrait of a greedy and dishonest Wren Hartley. Wren read the summons over and over, trying to find a hole in it, some flaw, some mistake that would prove her innocence. But everything matched with terrifying precision. The transactions had been made on dates when she was still employed by the company. The signatures had been forged so perfectly that even she had to look closely to realize they weren't hers. This was a trap that had been prepared long ago, waiting only for the right moment to close. And that moment had come when she dared refuse the Harrington family's $500,000. She sat there the entire day, staring at the paper as though if she looked at it long enough, it would disappear. But it didn't disappear. Why they're cold and merciless, reminding her that no matter how far she ran, the past would still find her. If she were convicted, she would go to prison. A mother carrying a child would give birth behind bars, and the baby would be sent to foster care or worse, taken into the custody of the Harrington family. Everything she had fought to protect would be lost, but that wasn't all. If she stayed here, the lawsuit would drag the Blackwell family into the storm. The press would dig into it, their enemies would use it, and the reputation of Eleanor, of Sterling, of the empire they had built, would suffer because of someone like her. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let the people who had taken her in pay for their kindness. The decision came to her at midnight, as she lay awake in bed staring at the dark ceiling. She had to leave. She had to disappear before things became even worse. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but she knew she couldn't stay and pull these good people down into the abyss with her. Ren sat up, silent in the darkness, and began packing her suitcase. She didn't have many things, only a few clothes Eleanor had given her, a few personal items, and the worn old suitcase she had carried with her on the first day. She left behind everything expensive the estate had provided, taking only what she had come with. Before leaving the room, she sat at the desk and wrote a letter to Eleanor. Her hand shook as she held the pen, and tears fell onto the page, blurring a few words, but she kept writing. She thanked her for everything, for the door that had opened when the rest of the world had slammed shut, for kindness that had asked for nothing in return. She apologized for having to leave like this, without a proper goodbye, and she promised that someday, somehow, she would repay her. The clock showed 2 o'clock in the morning when Ren opened her door, lifted the small suitcase, and began walking down the darkened hallway. The estate was silent as a grave, with only the faint whistle of wind outside the windows and the pounding of her own heart inside her chest. She moved through the familiar corridors, down the back staircase, toward the rear door leading into the garden. From there, she could walk to the side gate and vanish into the night before anyone knew she was gone. The garden was freezing in the dark. Mist spread white across the ground like a thin burial cloth. Her footsteps on the gravel sounded soft in the empty night, each one heavy, as though she were walking toward an abyss rather than freedom. She reached the back door, her hand closing around the cold brass handle. One turn, one push, and she would be outside. Just a few more steps. "Where are you going at this hour?" The voice came from the darkness and froze Ren where she stood, her heart seeming to stop for a beat. She turned, and from the corner untouched by moonlight, a figure stepped forward. Sterling Blackwell stood there, both hands in his trouser pockets, his eyes glinting in the dark like the eyes of a predator watching its prey. He wasn't wearing a suit as he always did, only a black shirt with the top few buttons undone, as though he hadn't been able to sleep either and had been wandering through the night. He came closer, slowly, unhurried, until he stood directly in the only path she could take to escape. There was no other way, no other exit. Ren stood there, her hand still clenched around the handle of the suitcase, looking at the man before her and knowing that every one of her plans had just collapsed completely. Sterling stood there like a statue carved from darkness, not shouting, not angry, only silent as he looked at her with eyes Ren couldn't read. Moonlight filtered through the glass and cast faint ghostly streaks across his face, carving out features sharp as blades, and the shadow of a man who had grown too used to standing in the dark. Ren swallowed hard and tried to keep her voice from trembling. "Please move aside," she said, her hand gripping the handle of the suitcase so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I don't want to cause any more trouble for you, and for Eleanor." Sterling didn't move. He only tilted his head slightly to one side, as though deciding whether she had just said something interesting or foolish. "You think you get to decide who is allowed to be trouble for me?" he asked, his voice low and even, like water moving deep underground. Ren felt anger flare in her chest, mingling with the fear and despair that had been building in her all day. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising despite herself. "The Harringtons won't stop. They have lawyers, they have judges, they have an entire legal system in their hands. They can twist the truth. They can turn an innocent person into a criminal with nothing more than a few papers and a few signatures." She took a step toward him, as if nearness might make him understand how serious this was. "They will destroy anyone who shelters me," she said, her voice shaking now. "I already lost my job, my home, the man I loved, even my own mother. I can't let you and Eleanor lose anything else because of me. Please, let me go." Sterling said nothing for so long that Ren began to wonder whether he had heard her at all. Then he stepped toward her. One step. Only one. But suddenly the space between them felt close enough to steal her breath. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he asked, his voice light as air and yet carrying a weight that made Ren hold her breath. Ren looked into his eyes, and for the first time she saw something different there. Not the coldness she had grown used to, not the indifference he always wore like armor, but something deeper, darker, like an ocean hidden beneath ice. She saw power, she saw danger, and she saw the vast loneliness he had concealed for so long. "The Harrington family," Sterling said slowly, each word measured as though he were savoring the sound of it. "You think they have power. You think they can ruin anyone they choose." He leaned closer, near enough for Wren to catch the faint scent of sandalwood and whiskey clinging to him. "They are people playing at power in a city where they imagine themselves kings. What they forget is that there are men who built empires before their grandparents even knew how to hold a fork properly." Silence settled over the garden. Wren stood there, her heart hammering wildly, unsure whether she should believe what he was saying or be even more afraid. She looked at Sterling, the man she had known only as a cold master of the house, a shadow moving through its vast halls, and for the first time she wondered just how badly she had underestimated him. "Go back inside," Sterling said, his voice softening slightly, though it still carried that quiet authority no one could argue with. "Go to sleep. In the morning, I will explain once, and only once." Wren wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need protection, that she could take care of herself, that she didn't want to owe anyone anything anymore. But when she opened her mouth, no sound came out. There was something in his voice that stopped her. Not an order, not a threat. Something else entirely. Something she had never expected to hear from a man like Sterling Blackwell. Concern. Very faint, almost impossible to notice, but it was there. Buried under the ice, hidden beneath the cold exterior, there was a small piece of real care, and it was that small piece that made Wren let go of the door handle. She said nothing. She only nodded, picked up the suitcase, and turned back toward the house. She didn't look behind her, but she could feel his gaze following every step she took until she disappeared behind the door. That night, Wren lay in bed staring at the ceiling until the first light of dawn slipped through the crack in the curtains. She couldn't sleep. Her mind spun with hundreds of questions that had no answers. Who was Sterling Blackwell, really? Why did he want her to stay? What could he do to the Harrington family that she didn't know about? And most of all, why did he care? When sunlight had fully poured into the room, Wren sat up with eyes heavy from lack of sleep. She reached for the court summons on the bedside table, intending to read it one more time, but her hand touched only the bare wood. The summons was gone. In its place lay a small folded note, the handwriting strong and sharp, as unmistakable as the man who had written it. Wren picked up the paper, and her heart seemed to stop when she read the brief lines. "It's been handled. Don't think about leaving again." There was no signature, no explanation, only 2 short sentences, yet they carried a promise Wren didn't know whether she should trust. She sat there with the note in her hand, and for the first time since receiving the summons, she allowed herself to cry. Not from fear, not from despair, but from something entirely different, because for the first time in her life, someone had fought for her without making her beg. A week passed in a strange kind of peace after the night Sterling stopped Wren at the back door. The embezzlement case vanished as though it had never existed, and no one on the estate mentioned it again. Wren went on with her work, went on with the silent meals, went on watching Sterling from a distance without daring to ask what he had done to make everything disappear so quickly. She knew better than to ask, but peace at Blackwell Estate never lasted very long. That afternoon, while Wren was sitting in the library with a book in her hands that she wasn't truly reading, Pierce appeared in the doorway with a tension in his face she had rarely seen before. "There's a visitor who wants to see you," he said, his voice even, though his eyes carried a quiet warning. "In the main drawing room, Mrs. Eleanor has agreed to it." Wren rose to her feet, her heart beating faster even though she didn't understand why. She followed Pierce through the familiar corridors, and when she stepped into the drawing room, her feet seemed to lock to the floor. Garrett Harrington was sitting on the deep blue velvet sofa, one leg crossed with casual ease, a cup of tea in his hand that someone had politely served him. He was still as handsome as she remembered, perhaps even more so. His dark brown hair was perfectly groomed, his charcoal suit tailored to flatter his tall frame, and that charming smile, the smile that had once made her melt, curved across his lips as though the past 3 months had never happened. "Wren," he said. He stood and opened his arms as if to embrace her. "I finally found you." Eleanor was seated in the chair opposite, quietly observing with blue eyes that missed nothing. She gave Wren a slight nod, then rose to her feet. "I'll leave the 2 of you to talk in private," she said in a neutral voice, and walked out of the room. But before she left, she cast a glance toward the corner of the room, where a small door led into the adjoining chamber. Wren didn't understand the meaning of that glance until later. Once they were alone, Garrett stepped closer, still wearing that warm, false smile. Wren moved back a step, instinct making her keep her distance. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice colder than she had thought possible. Garrett sighed, and his expression shifted from delight to regret with flawless ease. "Wren, I know I was wrong," he said, his voice low and velvety. "I've done a lot of thinking these past months. I acted like a coward, and I'm sorry. I want to make things right. I want to be the father of this baby. Give me a chance." Wren looked at him, at the man she had once loved enough to believe every empty promise, and she felt her heart turn cold, not with pain the way she had imagined, but with the deepest disappointment at realizing just how blind she had once been. "3 months ago," she said slowly, "when I told you I was pregnant, what did you say?" He blinked once, the smile trembling for the briefest second before he regained control. "Wren, I know I said horrible things. I was scared. I wasn't ready. Take care of it. Don't bother me." Wren cut him off, her voice hard as steel. "That was the exact message you sent. I remember every word." The room fell silent. The mask of regret on Garrett's face began to crack, revealing something colder and more calculating underneath. "Circumstances have changed," he said, his voice still smooth but no longer warm. "My grandfather isn't well. He wants to see an heir before he dies. The family needs this child." And there it was. The truth. Wren saw it at once. He hadn't come because he regretted anything. He hadn't come because he loved her or wanted to be a father. He had come because his grandfather needed a grandson to satisfy the terms of a will, and the child in her womb was the most convenient answer. "This baby is mine," Wren said, each word clear and final. "Not yours. You gave up every right the day you told me to get rid of it. Get out." Garrett's eyes flashed with danger, and for the first time, he dropped the charming mask completely. His face turned cold and cruel, just like his father's, just like the entire Harrington bloodline she had only heard about in whispers. "You think you have a choice?" he asked, his voice soft and threatening. "Sign over custody, or go to prison for embezzlement. That's all there is to it. You think that lawsuit disappeared? It was only paused. One call from my father, and you'll be in handcuffs before sunset." Wren felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. She wanted to scream in his face, wanted to strike that beautiful, hateful face, but before she could react, the door opened without a sound. Sterling stepped in as though he were entering his own office, not hurried, not threatening. Only the pure presence of a man accustomed to owning every room he entered. He walked straight to the liquor cabinet in the corner, poured himself a whiskey, then turned and sat down in the armchair opposite Garrett. His movements were slow, easy, as though he had 1,000 years to waste. Garrett stood there, stunned by the unexpected intrusion. "Sterling Blackwell," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "I didn't know you were involved in this." Sterling didn't answer right away. He took a sip of whiskey, let the taste settle on his tongue, then finally lifted his head and looked at Garrett, and that look made Wren shiver even though it wasn't meant for her. It was the way a tiger looked at a rabbit before deciding whether it was worth the pounce. "Harrison Harrington," Sterling said softly, each word precise. "Atlantic City, 1987. I have the full file." Garrett went pale, not pale in the ordinary way of a frightened man. He turned white as paper, as if every drop of blood in his body had frozen all at once. You don't have the right," he stammered. Sterling set the whiskey glass down on the table, the sound of glass against wood echoing through the room like a sentence being passed. He said nothing more. He only looked at him, and that silence was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Garrett swallowed hard, shot Wren one last glance full of hatred, then turned and hurried out of the room. The sound of his shoes struck the stone floor in quick, sharp beats, then faded, then vanished. Silence settled over the room again. Wren stood there, one hand still resting over her belly, looking at Sterling seated in the armchair like a king upon his throne, and for the first time, she truly saw him. Not as the polished chief executive of a charitable empire, not as Eleanor's cold, distant grandson, but as the ruler of an empire beneath the surface, a man even powerful families like the Harringtons had to bow before. She didn't know whether she ought to be afraid or grateful. Perhaps both. After Garrett left the estate with a face as pale as a corpse, Wren's life seemed to return to its usual rhythm. She continued her work in the small office, continued the quiet meals with Eleanor, continued counting the days until the child in her womb would be ready to enter the world. But something had changed, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the mansion that she couldn't quite name. Sterling began appearing within her sight more often, not in arranged meetings or long conversations, but in brief moments scattered throughout the day. He passed by her office in the morning, pausing for the smallest fraction of a second before continuing on. He sat at the head of the table during dinners, and no longer left in haste the way he once had. He appeared in the library at the very moment she was searching for a book, as though he had some sixth sense for her schedule. Wren didn't know whether it was accidental or deliberate. She only knew that each time their eyes met, she no longer felt fear or awkwardness. Instead, there was something warmer, something more familiar, like two strangers slowly learning how to exist in the same space. One night, when the moon hung high in a cloudless sky and sleep refused to come, Wren pulled on a sweater and stepped out onto the balcony. But the balcony wasn't enough. She needed fresher air, needed the feel of ground beneath her feet, so she went down into the garden. The stone bench beside the fountain was already occupied. Sterling sat there, one hand resting along the back of the bench, his eyes lifted to the star-filled sky, as though searching for answers to questions no one dared ask aloud. He didn't turn when he heard her footsteps on the gravel, but he didn't leave either. Wren hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat beside him, leaving just enough space between them to remain proper. Neither of them spoke. There was no greeting, no polite question, nothing at all to disturb the stillness of the night. They simply sat there, two lonely figures beneath the silver moonlight, listening to the soft murmur of water from the fountain and the wind whispering through the trees. And for the first time, the silence between them was no longer heavy. It became easy, even comforting, like a warm blanket wrapped around two souls already exhausted by battles of their own. From the bedroom window on the second floor, Eleanor stood watching the two of them in the garden with the faintest smile on her lips. Moonlight touched her silver hair, and her eyes shone with something that looked very much like satisfaction. Her plan was working. She hadn't invited Wren here only to repay a debt to her father. She had invited her because she had seen something her grandson needed and did not know how to seek for himself. That night, when Wren returned to her room after nearly 2 hours of sitting in silence beside Sterling, she felt something she had forgotten a very long time ago: safety. She no longer felt like a fugitive hiding in borrowed shelter. She was beginning to feel as though she belonged here. But hundreds of miles away, in another Harrington mansion, Harrington Sr. sat in his study with his face flushed red from fury. He had just heard Garrett's report about the disastrous meeting at Blackwell Estate, and every word had cut into his pride like a blade. Blackwell dared threaten his family, dared bring up Atlantic City. He slammed his fist down on the desk, knocking over the glass of wine there. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood. He didn't accept defeat, never had, and if the law could no longer be used, he would use other means. He reached for the telephone and dialed a familiar number. When the person on the other end answered, his voice was cold as ice. "I need your men, and I need them discreet." Mrs. Thornton had worked for the Blackwell family for 15 years. She had witnessed Eleanor's grief after losing her husband, witnessed Sterling transform from a broken 19-year-old into the cold man he had become today, witnessed this mansion pass through spring, summer, autumn, and winter, again and again. She loved this family as though it were her own, but in her blood family, only one person remained. Her son, Daniel, 32 years old, handsome, intelligent, and carrying within him the disease of gambling addiction that she had tried to hide for 10 years. The call came at 2 o'clock in the morning, when the entire estate was asleep. "Mrs. Thornton answered with trembling hands, and the voice on the other end made the blood in her veins turn to ice. They told her Daniel was in their hands. He owed $800,000 at a casino in which the Harrington family held a stake. And in 72 hours, if the money wasn't paid, her son would disappear. Not disappear in the sense of running away, disappear in the sense that no one would ever find him again. She collapsed onto the edge of the bed, the phone still pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face in silence. She didn't have $800,000. She wouldn't make that much in her entire lifetime. She could ask Eleanor, but she knew there would be no way to explain why she needed such an enormous sum without revealing the shameful secret of her son. Then the voice on the other end offered another option. No money, only information. About the woman staying at Blackwell Estate. Her schedule. The times she was alone. The locations of the security cameras. the patrol schedule of the guards, and any weaknesses in the security system that Mrs. Thornton knew of. In exchange, Daniel would be released, and every debt would be erased. Mrs. Thornton sat in the darkness all night, torn between loyalty and motherhood. She thought of Eleanor, who had treated her like family, had helped her when her husband died, had given her steady work and a warm home. She thought of Sterling, the lonely boy she had watched grow up, had quietly observed trying to heal wounds no one else could see. And she thought of Wren, the young pregnant woman with sad eyes, who thanked her each time she brought breakfast to her room, who smiled at her as though she mattered. But then she thought of Daniel, her only son, the child she had brought into the world in pain, raised with sweat and tears, loved without condition no matter how many mistakes he made. $800,000 in gambling debt. She had known for a long time that this day would come, but she had never imagined it would come like this. By the time the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, Mrs. Thornton had made her decision. She called the number back, and with a voice made raw by a night of weeping, she agreed to the bargain. She told them everything. Wren's schedule, the time she was alone in the office or the library, the camera locations she knew by heart after 15 years of service, the patrol hours of the security staff, and most important of all, the greenhouse behind the estate, where few people ever passed, and where there were no surveillance cameras. The next day, Mrs. Thornton met Wren in the hallway, with the same warm smile she always wore. "Miss Wren, the flowers in the drawing room have all wilted," she said gently. "The greenhouse out back has some beautiful new roses in bloom. Would you like to go choose a few? The fresh air would be good for the baby, too." Wren smiled, without the slightest suspicion. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Thornton," she replied, then made her way toward the back door leading into the garden. Mrs. Thornton stood at the window and watched the young woman walk down the gravel path toward the greenhouse. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't call Wren back. She couldn't. When Wren disappeared beyond the line of trees, Mrs. Thornton turned away, covering her face with both hands, trying to choke back the sob rising in her throat. "Forgive me," she whispered to no one at all. "Please forgive me." And Wren, relieved and unsuspecting, stepped into the greenhouse without knowing that darkness was waiting for her behind the rose bushes. Late that afternoon, the sky had already begun to turn the ash gray of approaching winter. The days were growing shorter, and when Wren stepped into the greenhouse behind the estate, the natural light was so weak that the yellow lamps switched on automatically, spreading a soft, warm glow through the space. She drew in a deep breath, letting the scent of damp soil and roses fill her lungs, feeling the rare peace this place always seemed to offer. The greenhouse was a world of its own, separate from the cold luxury of the main mansion. Pots of flowers stood in neat rows, from deep red roses to pure white chrysanthemums, from stately purple orchids to wild blossoms Wren didn't know by name. She walked slowly down the narrow path between the plants, her hand brushing gently over the soft petals, choosing the loveliest blooms to bring back to the drawing room. The baby in her womb gave a small kick, as if enjoying this quiet moment with her. Wren smiled, laid a hand over her belly, and whispered tender words meant only for the two of them. She didn't hear the glass door open behind her, didn't hear the footsteps, soft as a cat's, on the damp tile floor. She only had time to feel a cold draft brush the back of her neck before 3 dark figures appeared out of nowhere, surrounding her from 3 sides. Wren tried to turn, tried to cry out for help, but everything happened too fast. A large hand clamped over her mouth, another arm locked across her chest, and before she could understand what was happening, a sweet chemical smell rushed into her nose. The world tilted, the yellow lights blurred, and then everything sank into darkness. The pot of roses she had been holding slipped from her hands, and red petals scattered across the tile like drops of blood. 20 minutes later, Pierce realized something was wrong. Miss Hartley had gone to the greenhouse too long ago, and still hadn't come back. The instincts of a man who had spent too many years in the underworld wouldn't let him ignore that feeling. He checked the security cameras, and when he saw what was playing on the screen, his heart seemed to stop for a beat. The footage showed 3 figures dressed in black, dragging an unconscious woman out through the back door of the greenhouse and shoving her into a black van with no license plates waiting on the service road behind the estate. The timestamp on the footage said 23 minutes earlier. Pierce ran. He ran faster than he ever had in his life, tearing through the long corridors and kicking open the door of the meeting room where Sterling was seated with 3 important foreign business partners. Every eye in the room swung toward Pierce as he burst in, breathing hard, his face white as paper. Mr. Blackwell, Pierce said, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. Miss Hartley. They took her. The room froze in silence. The three business partners sat there looking confused, with no idea what was happening. But Sterling understood. He understood from the moment Pierce opened his mouth. And what happened next made all three foreign men shiver, even though none of this had anything to do with them. Sterling stood up. He didn't say a word, didn't explain, didn't apologize for ending the meeting in the middle of it. He simply rose and walked out of the room as though the three partners worth hundreds of millions of dollars were nothing more than shadows. His face showed no expression, cold and hard as the stone statue he had always seemed to be. But his eyes were different. Those eyes were burning now with a fire Pierce had never seen in 10 years of working beside him. This wasn't ordinary anger. It was a fury held back for far too long, boiling beneath the frozen surface, waiting to be unleashed. Eleanor was walking down the corridor when she saw her grandson come out of the meeting room with a pace far longer and more urgent than usual. She hurried after him, her silver-tipped cane striking the stone floor in quick, sharp taps. "Sterling," she called. "What happened?" Sterling didn't stop, didn't turn around. He only said 3 words, his voice flat as a lake before a storm. They took her. 3 words. Only 3 words. But Eleanor understood. She understood that her grandson, the man who controlled every situation with cold composure, was about to become something truly monstrous. And she understood, too, that, though Sterling might never have said it aloud, the young pregnant woman had become a part of him he couldn't afford to lose. Sterling stopped at the end of the corridor and turned to look at Pierce standing behind him. His eyes were no longer icy. They were a frozen hell, the kind no one entered and came back from whole. "Find out who did this," he said, his voice cold as a sharpened blade. "Gather everyone, and prepare everything." Pierce nodded once and vanished into the shadows. Within the next hour, Blackwell Estate turned into a true command center. Men Wren had never seen before began appearing from every direction, each one wearing the same taut expression of men ready for war. The hunt had begun, and Sterling Blackwell wasn't going to stop until he found her. The first hour passed in organized chaos. Sterling stood in the middle of his study, both hands braced against the desk, looking down at the map of the area spread out before him. Around him, 30 men had gathered in full, familiar faces Wren had never once seen during her time at the estate. They had come from everywhere, each one carrying the same tense expression and the same eyes ready for war. No one said much. No one needed to. Sterling gave orders in a steady voice, without shouting, without slamming anything, without showing the slightest sign of losing control. But it was that calm that was most terrifying. Everyone knew that when Sterling Blackwell went quiet, hell was about to open its doors. Pierce moved back and forth between the groups, assigning tasks, checking weapons, contacting underground sources across the city. The Blackwell network spread farther than anyone could imagine, and within an hour, every eye and every ear in the underworld was searching for the black van and the pregnant woman who had been taken. The second hour brought a painful discovery. When Pierce reviewed the entire security camera system again, he noticed something unusual. The camera covering the greenhouse area had been turned off exactly 15 minutes before Wren entered, then switched back on after she disappeared. Only someone on the inside could have done that. Suspicion narrowed quickly to the one person who had both access to the cameras and a reason to suggest that Wren go to the greenhouse at precisely that moment. Mrs. Thornton was brought into Sterling's study less than 10 minutes later. She didn't deny it, didn't try to defend herself. She simply fell to her knees in the middle of the room, tears pouring down her face like rain, and told them everything. About Daniel, about the $800,000 debt, about the threats from Harrington's men, about the impossible choice between loyalty and motherhood. Sterling stood there listening, his face expressionless as stone. When she finished, he stayed silent for a long time, long enough that everyone in the room held their breath and waited. Then he spoke, his voice flat and still, as water in a bottle. "You will face the consequences later," he said. "Now tell me everything. Where did they take her? How many men were there? Were they armed? Anything you know, Mrs." Thornton told them everything she had heard on the phone, and everything she had guessed from the way they had acted. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Pierce to begin narrowing the search. In the third hour, a source at the docks reported that a black van had been seen heading toward the outskirts, toward the abandoned industrial district at the edge of the city. Pierce checked the property records and found an old warehouse, on paper owned by a small transport company. But when he dug deeper, that company turned out to belong to a parent company in which the Harringtons held controlling shares. Sterling rose and reached for the black leather jacket hanging on the hook beside the door. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a general preparing to step into a final battle. In the 4th hour, just as Sterling was about to get into the car, Eleanor stopped him at the door. She stood there with her silver cane in hand, her eyes full of worry, but also full of understanding. "Let someone else go," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You are the one in charge. You don't need to go yourself." Sterling cut her off, not rudely, but with no room for argument. "You know I have to go." Eleanor looked into her grandson's eyes, and there she saw what she had been waiting to see for 30 years. Not coldness, not calculation, but the fire of a man fighting for what he loved. She was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Bring her home," she said gently. Then she stepped aside and let Sterling pass. In the 5th hour, the Blackwell convoy stopped 200 meters from the warehouse. Sterling got out first, moonlight falling across his face like stone carved into human form. He said nothing, only made a signal, and his men silently spread out, surrounding the building from every direction. What happened next disappeared into darkness. No one retold the details. There were only footsteps echoing through the empty night, then the clash of metal, muffled screams, and finally silence. In the 6th hour, the warehouse door opened. Sterling stepped out of the darkness, and Wren was in his arms. She was unconscious, her brown hair loosened and tangled over his arm, her face pale but showing no severe injuries that could be seen. The baby in her womb was still safe, still protected by her mother's body, and by the man carrying her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. Sterling's suit jacket was wrinkled, his sleeves rolled up to reveal scratches along his forearms, and the black hair he usually wore so perfectly groomed was now in disarray. He looked like a man who had just come through battle, and perhaps he had, but his eyes looked nowhere except at the face of the woman in his arms. Pierce opened the car door, and Sterling carefully placed Wren in the back seat. He didn't let anyone else sit beside her. He climbed in himself, rested her head against his shoulder, and kept one arm firmly around her so she wouldn't be jolted when the car moved. The entire drive back, he didn't take his eyes off her for a single second. He didn't care about what had happened inside the warehouse. Didn't care about the fate of the men who had dared lay hands on her. Didn't care about the Harringtons or any consequences that might follow after this night. The only thing he cared about now was her soft breathing, the steady beat of her heart beneath the thin fabric of her dress, the baby in her womb still safe. When the convoy returned to the estate, Eleanor was already waiting at the front entrance, despite the late hour and the bitter cold of the winter night. She watched her grandson carry the woman out of the car, and she saw the very thing she had been waiting to see for all these years. Sterling Blackwell, the man who had locked his heart away since he was 19 years old, had finally opened the door for someone to walk in. Everything had changed. She knew that, and she knew that from this night forward, Blackwell Estate would never be the same again. Wren opened her eyes in panic. Darkness flooded her vision for the first few seconds, and the memory of rough hands, of that sweet chemical smell, of absolute helplessness, rushed back into her mind like a violent tide. She was about to cry out, about to struggle, but her hand touched something soft and familiar. Silk, bedsheets, the faint scent of lavender from the vase beside the window. She was lying in her own bed, in her own room, in Blackwell Estate, safe. The gentle light from the bedside lamp fell across the face of a middle-aged woman sitting beside her, a stethoscope pressed against her belly. Doctor Celeste, the Blackwell family's private physician, looked at her with warm eyes full of concern. "You're awake," she said softly. "Don't move too much. The baby is fine. The heartbeat is strong. But you need complete rest for the next few days. Your body has been through a serious shock." Wren nodded weakly, one hand moving instinctively to her stomach as if to confirm that her child was still there, still safe. Then her gaze traveled across the room, and she saw a figure standing in the far corner, his back to her, looking out the window where moonlight spread silver across the glass. Sterling didn't turn around, but she knew he had already realized she was awake. Perhaps he had been there the whole time, waiting in silence, like a guardian carved from stone. "Those men," Wren began, her voice rough from dryness and weakness. Sterling cut her off before she could finish, his voice flat as a frozen lake. "You don't need to know." Silence settled over the room. Doctor. Celeste gave a small cough, gathered up her medical instruments, and quietly left, closing the door behind her with care. Only the two of them remained in the room filled with moonlight and unspoken questions. Wren looked at Sterling's broad back, and she understood. She understood that he had done things she wasn't meant to know, things he didn't want her to know. He had stepped into darkness to pull her back, and that darkness wasn't something he wanted her to see. She had seen who he truly was, not through rumors or stories, but through the way he stood there now, his back straight as a wall, his shoulders carrying the weight of what he had done and what he would do. A mafia boss, the man the entire city feared. A man willing to burn down the world if anyone dared touch what belonged to him. Before the week was over, the matter of Mrs. Thornton was finally settled. Sterling had initially intended to deliver a ruthless sentence, for he never tolerated betrayal. But Wren, after learning about the debt and the mother's desperate love for her son, had intervened. At her request, Mrs. Thornton was not handed over to the police or cast into the streets. Instead, she was allowed to retire quietly to a small cottage far from the Hamptons. Sterling cleared her son's gambling debts one last time, ensuring Daniel was safe, on the strict condition that neither of them ever set foot near the Blackwell estate again. It was a mercy Mrs. Thornton didn't deserve, but one that Wren insisted upon, proving that the light in the house was now stronger than the shadows. The next day, Wren asked to be left alone. She needed time. She needed space to think, to put everything in her mind back into order before she could face anyone. Eleanor agreed at once, instructed the staff to bring meals to her room, and ordered that no one was to disturb her unless she asked for it. Sterling didn't appear again after that night. 3 days passed. 3 days in which Wren lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting her thoughts drift through every corner of memory and feeling. She thought about Garrett, about the 3 years she had believed in his false promises, about the way he had discarded her like an old thing once she was no longer convenient. She thought about her old company, about the co-workers who had laughed with her every day and then turned their backs without a word when she was fired. She thought about her mother, about the cold look in her eyes and the words "you brought this on yourself," still echoing in Wren's head every night. What had the world she once believed was good, safe, and trustworthy done to her? It had betrayed her, abandoned her, pushed her to the edge of an abyss, and not one hand had reached out to pull her back. Then she thought about Sterling, the cold man she had once been afraid of. What had he done? He had opened the door when no one else would. He had sheltered her without asking for anything in return. He had made the embezzlement case disappear without a word. He had driven Garrett away with a single sentence. And when she was taken, he had set the entire underworld on fire to find her, had stepped into the darkness himself to bring her back. She found herself wondering, am I falling into Stockholm Syndrome? She had read about it, about the way victims sometimes develop feelings for the person holding them captive, about the confusion between gratitude and love, but Sterling hadn't taken her captive. He had saved her, and she wasn't afraid of him. She realized that on the morning of the 3rd day, when the first sunlight broke through the curtains and woke her from her restless sleep, she wasn't afraid of Sterling Blackwell. She had never truly been afraid of him, not even when she thought she was. What she feared was losing the sense of safety he gave her, losing the place where she had finally begun to belong, losing the man who had looked at her not as a burden or a problem to be managed, but as someone worth protecting. She got out of bed, slowly and carefully now that her body was heavier with pregnancy. She changed clothes, brushed her hair, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was no longer the ragged fugitive who had stood at the estate gates 2 months earlier. She was still tired, still pale, but in her eyes there was something new, resolve. She needed answers. She needed to know who he really was, and more than that, she needed to know what she was to him. Wren stepped out of her room, walked down the familiar corridor, and stopped in front of the library door, the place where they had spoken for the first time, the place where everything had begun to change. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and he was already there, sitting in the familiar armchair beside the fireplace, as though he had known she would come. Sterling didn't rise when she entered. He only sat there in the dark brown armchair, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, the other holding a whiskey glass already half empty. The firelight danced across his face, casting alternating bands of light and shadow that made him look like a chiaroscuro painting by a 17th century master. When he saw Wren step across the threshold, he paused for a beat, then gently set the whiskey glass down on the table beside him. A small gesture, but for Sterling Blackwell, It was his way of saying she had all of his attention. Wren moved slowly across the vast library, her shoes making no sound on the thick carpet, but she knew he was following every step she took. She sat in the chair opposite him, where the fire warmed her face and gave the room the gentlest light it could offer. Between them was a distance no wider than an arm's length, yet it felt as though an ocean of unspoken things lay there. "I need to know," Wren spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "Who are you really?" Sterling didn't answer at once. He looked at her for a long time, his eyes flickering in the firelight, as if weighing whether she had earned the truth. Then he leaned forward, both elbows braced on his knees, his gaze fixed on hers. "I am the man this entire city fears," he said, his voice deep as a bronze bell sounding through the night. "I am the one who signs decisions no one dares mention. I am the darkness people whisper about after midnight. I am the reason families like the Harringtons bow their heads no matter how much money they have or how much political power they command." He paused, letting those words settle into the air between them. "That is what I am in the eyes of the world." Wren listened without blinking, without showing fear, without judgment. When he stopped, she tilted her head slightly and looked at him with gray-blue eyes bright as stars in the dark. "I didn't ask who other people think you are," she said slowly, each word clear. "I asked who you think you are." That question made Sterling go still. For the first time since Wren had known him, she saw something like surprise flicker across the face that almost never betrayed emotion. He straightened in his chair and looked at her as though she had just spoken in a language he had never heard before. "No one has ever asked me that," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Not once." "I'm asking," Wren answered, without retreating. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the suffocating kind that had once lived there. This was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something vast, deciding whether they dared step forward. Sterling rose from the chair, every movement slow and deliberate. He walked toward Wren, one step at a time, until he stood directly before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming from his body. He looked down at her, and this time the ice in his eyes had melted, revealing something hot and fierce beneath. "I am the man who would burn this world to the ground," he said, his voice low and rough, as though confessing the darkest truth he carried inside him. "If anyone ever dared touch what is mine." Wren lifted her face to him, her heart pounding so hard she thought he might hear it. She swallowed, then asked the question she had held in her heart for 3 days. "And I belong to you?" The question hung in the air, fragile as a butterfly caught in a storm. Sterling looked at her, and in that moment all the walls he had built over 33 years seemed to fall away. He no longer looked like a powerful Mafia kingpin. He looked only like a man standing before the woman he cared about, trying to find words for something he had never known how to say. "From the moment you walked through those gates," he said, his voice light as wind. The library fell utterly still. There was only the crackle of fire in the hearth and the sound of their breathing. Wren felt tears rise to her eyes, not from sorrow or fear, but from something so overwhelming she couldn't name it. She rose from the chair, slowly and carefully because of the weight of her pregnancy. She stepped closer to him, closer than anyone had ever dared come to Sterling Blackwell without permission. Close enough to see every dark lash, every small scratch on his skin that he had carried home from that night. Then she did something no one had ever done. She reached out and laid her hand over his. Her hand was small and warm. His was large and rough, the perfect contrast of two worlds colliding and somehow fitting together exactly as they should. "I'm not afraid of you," Wren said, her voice trembling slightly, though her gaze never wavered. "I'm afraid of losing this." Sterling looked down at her hand resting on his, and she saw his jaw tighten, as though he were fighting something inside himself. He looked so long that Wren began to wonder if she had done the wrong thing. Then he lifted his eyes again, and in them she saw something she had never seen before. Not ice, not calculation, but gentleness. So faint it was almost impossible to recognize, but it was there. "You should rest," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "The baby needs you strong." That was Sterling Blackwell's way of saying I care about you, not with grand declarations or easy promises, but with action, with concern hidden inside every word. Yet he didn't pull his hand away, and she didn't let go. They stood there in the library full of books and firelight, their hands joined as if that was the only thing keeping them from falling into the abyss. There was no kiss, no vow, only the naked truth between two lonely souls who had finally found one another. And sometimes, that is all that is needed. 2 weeks after that night in the library, snow began to fall in the Hamptons. It was a rare thing in that part of the world, where the climate was usually mild and winter brought cold weather but seldom true snowfall. But on that night, white flakes began drifting down from the dark sky, laying a thin veil over the garden and the slate roofs of Blackwell Estate, as though nature itself were preparing a pure white blanket to welcome a new life into the world. Wren felt the first contractions at 10 o'clock that night. She was sitting in the library, which had become her favorite corner of the house, when suddenly a tight wave of pain spread through her lower belly. She drew in a deep breath, laid her hand over her stomach, and knew at once that the time had come. Everything had been prepared weeks earlier. Dr. Celeste arrived immediately, bringing all the medical equipment needed for a home delivery. Wren had refused to go to the hospital, even though Eleanor and Dr. Celeste had both urged her to reconsider. She never said it aloud, but after everything that had happened, Blackwell Estate was the only place where she felt truly safe, and she wanted her child to be born in the safest place she knew. Eleanor stayed beside her through the entire night. The older woman sat by the bed, her wrinkled but warm hand holding Wren's tightly, whispering words of encouragement every time the pain came. "You're doing so well. Just a little more. I'm here with you." Wren clung to Eleanor's hand as though it were the only lifeline in a storm of pain. She had once believed she would face this moment alone, in a cold hospital room, with no one beside her. But now she had Eleanor, she had Dr. Celeste, and she had that too, the presence she could feel just beyond the closed door. Sterling was out in the hallway. He had been there ever since Dr. Celeste entered the room and ordered every man out. Pierce stood beside him on watch, and the two of them could hear Wren's cries through the heavy wooden door. Sterling wanted to go in. Pierce could see that in the way he stood, in the way his fists kept tightening, in the way he repeatedly glanced at the door, as though weighing whether to kick it open. "You can't go in there right now," Pierce said, his voice calm but firm. Sterling turned and looked at him, and the force of that look would have made anyone else step back. "Don't tell me what I can do," he said through clenched teeth, cold and dangerous. "Mrs. Eleanor will call for you when it's over," Pierce answered, without flinching. "This isn't a battlefield you can charge into." Sterling didn't reply. He only turned away and began pacing the length of the corridor, his long, urgent strides like those of a wolf trapped in a cage. He wasn't used to this feeling of helplessness. He was the man who controlled every situation, the man who made decisions, the man who solved every problem. But inside that room there was a battle he couldn't join, and it was driving him mad. The hours passed like years. Outside, the snow fell thicker, whitening the window panes and softening every sound in the world beyond the estate. In the dim hallway, Sterling kept pacing, Pierce kept his vigil, and both of them listened to every sound that drifted through the door. Then at 4:47 in the morning, a cry rang out, the first cry of a new life, high and pure, splitting the silence of the winter night. Sterling froze where he stood, his eyes widening as though he had just heard the most beautiful sound of his life. The door opened, and Eleanor stepped out wearing the brightest smile Pierce had ever seen on her face. "Go in," she said to Sterling, her voice thick with emotion. Sterling stepped into the room, and for the first time in his life, the steps that were steady in every situation became slow and cautious. He walked as though he were treading on thin glass, afraid that any movement too sharp might shatter something precious. Wren lay in bed, her brown hair damp with sweat and clinging to her forehead, her face pale with exhaustion, yet her eyes were shining with happiness. And in her arms, wrapped in a pure white blanket, was a tiny newborn baby. Sterling stood beside the bed and looked down at the child. The baby girl had her eyes closed, the flushed pink skin of a newborn, and a tiny mouth moving softly as though she were dreaming of something. She was so small, so fragile, and so beautiful that it stole the breath from his chest. He reached out slowly, carefully, and touched the silk soft hair on the baby's head. So lightly it was almost no touch at all, as though he feared she might vanish if he used too much force. She was the smallest life he had ever touched, and the most precious. "Her name is Rosalie," Wren said softly, her voice hoarse with exhaustion but overflowing with love. "Rosalie," Sterling repeated, letting the name rest on his tongue, carving it into memory. Rosalie. Outside the door, Eleanor stood beside Pierce, looking in through the narrow opening. She saw her grandson, the man the entire city feared, standing beside the bed with eyes softened in a way that seemed impossible. She saw the way he looked at the child who wasn't his, looked at the woman who wasn't his wife, with the feeling she had waited 30 years to see in him. 30 years, she whispered to Pierce, her voice trembling. I've never seen him look at anyone that way. Pierce nodded and said nothing, but he saw it too. The whole estate would see it soon enough. Their master had changed, and that change had begun with the woman lying in that bed and the baby in her arms. Inside the room, Sterling turned and looked at Wren. His steel blue eyes met her gray-blue ones, and in that moment, no other words were needed. You did well, he said, his voice low and quiet, carrying something Wren had never heard in it before: admiration, gratitude, and perhaps a trace of something that looked very much like love. It was the first praise he had truly given her. Not praise for her work, not praise for her courage, but praise for her very self, for the miracle she had just brought into the world. And from Sterling Blackwell, a man who never spoke soft, useless words, it was more than a confession. 3 months passed like a gentle dream Wren hardly dared believe was real. Rosalie grew quickly, like a young sapling nourished with all the love and care she could ever need, her gray-blue eyes, so like her mother's, lighting up whenever she saw familiar faces. She became the center of the estate, the light around which the entire vast mansion seemed to turn. Eleanor could sit for hours beside the baby's cradle, singing lullabies and telling stories she had never told anyone before. And Sterling, the man the whole city feared, could stand silently by the nursery door every night, watching the baby sleep with a tenderness in his eyes, so astonishing that no one who knew him would have believed it possible. Wren and Sterling had fallen into a rhythm of their own, one that needed no words for either of them to understand the other. They ate breakfast together every day, not because anyone required it, but because both of them appeared in the dining room at exactly the same time, as if by a habit neither had ever needed to discuss. They walked through the garden in the late afternoons, Sterling pushing Rosalie's pram while Wren walked beside him, and they could spend an hour that way without either of them saying a single word. But that silence was no longer cold. It was warm, easy, and full of things that didn't need to be spoken aloud. One late spring afternoon, when Rosalie was already 3 months old and sleeping peacefully in Eleanor's arms downstairs, Sterling found Wren in the library. She was sitting in the familiar armchair by the fireplace, though the fire had long been out because the weather had turned warm, reading an old novel she was already on her 3rd time through. He entered without a sound, but she knew he was there. She always knew when he was near. Sterling sat down in the chair opposite, where he had sat on that fateful night 3 months before. He didn't circle around the point. He didn't begin with meaningless courtesies. That wasn't his way. You and the child, he said, his voice low and firm. From now on, you are mine. No one touches you. Wren set the book down and looked at him with wide eyes. She had grown used to the way he spoke, used to his bluntness that hid behind nothing, but even so she hadn't expected this. Is that a proposal? She asked, her voice holding a trace of bewilderment and something very close to laughter. That's the truth, Sterling answered without blinking. Wren tilted her head and studied the man sitting before her, the man who had saved her, protected her, and looked at a child who wasn't his with eyes as though she were the most precious treasure in his life. You haven't even said you love me, she said gently, not accusing him, only stating a fact. Sterling was silent for a moment. She could see him struggling with something inside himself, trying to find a way to put into words something he had never been taught how to say. I'm not good at saying those things, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. But if you need to hear it— No, Wren cut in, rising from the chair. I don't need to hear it. I've seen it. She walked toward him, closer than she had ever come before. He lifted his head to look at her, and in that moment, the most powerful man in the city looked like a boy waiting for judgment. Wren bent down and pressed a kiss to his forehead, gentle and tender, the way she kissed Rosalie every night. Sterling went completely still, as though he didn't know how to react to such softness. Then slowly, carefully, like a man doing something for the first time in his life, his arm circled her waist and pulled her down into his lap. They sat there in silence, she in his arms, and for the first time, both of them knew they were home. A week later, the wedding took place in the library itself, where everything had begun. There was no grand reception, no hundreds of guests, no press, no cameras. Only Eleanor standing with the pride of a mother, Pierce standing as both friend and loyal right hand, Dr. Celeste smiling nearby, and Rosalie sleeping peacefully in her great-grandmother's arms. Wren wore a simple white dress, without jewels or elaborate embroidery, only soft silk falling gently over the body that had found its shape again after 3 months. In her hand she held a single red rose, cut from the garden she loved. Sterling wore black as he always did, but on his lapel a red rose had been pinned with care, identical to the one Wren held. When the minister asked Sterling whether he took Wren as his wife, he answered with only 2 words. "I do." His voice didn't tremble, but his eyes did. For the first time, Wren saw something glimmer in those steel blue eyes, something he had hidden for so many years finally finding its way to the surface. The wedding ring wasn't diamond or costly platinum. It was a simple white gold band that Sterling had chosen himself, without asking for anyone's advice, without wanting anyone's opinion. And to Wren, that ring was more beautiful than any diamond in the world. After the ceremony, when everyone else had drifted away, Eleanor came to Wren and took her hand in her own wrinkled but warm hands. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to this family," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Wren couldn't speak. She could only hold Eleanor and let her tears fall onto the older woman's shoulder. Tears of happiness, of gratitude, and of a heart that had finally found the place where it belonged. 2 years passed as swiftly as a bird flying past a spring window. Blackwell Estate was now filled with the laughter of children, with the patter of tiny feet running through the hallways, with cries of Mama and Papa echoing through the mornings and evenings. Rosalie was now 2 years old, a lovely little girl with her mother's brown hair and eyes bright as the sky after rain. She could chatter all day long, and her most patient listener was none other than Eleanor. And then there was Bennett, Wren and Sterling's son, born 10 months after the wedding. He had deep blue eyes like his father, and a quiet nature so much like Sterling's that anyone who saw him had to smile. While Rosalie never stopped talking, Bennett simply sat and watched, his large round eyes following everything around him with the focus of an adult living inside the body of a baby. Sterling treated both children the same, never once distinguishing between Rosalie, who wasn't his by blood, and Bennett, who carried his name and bloodline. They were both his children. They both belonged to him, and anyone bold enough to say otherwise would be met with the same icy stare the whole city still feared. Eleanor had grown weaker with each passing day over those 2 years. Yet she had never been happier. She spent hours with Rosalie in the garden, teaching her the name of every flower, how to care for the soil, how to listen to the wind. She told the little girl old stories her own mother had once told her, stories of strong women who had walked through darkness and found the light. And every afternoon she held Bennett in her arms, singing lullabies in a voice roughened by age but still overflowing with love. One autumn afternoon, when the maple leaves had begun to turn brilliant shades of red and gold, Eleanor called Wren into her private room. She lay in the large bed covered in white sheets, her head resting on a soft feather pillow, her eyes turned toward the window where the long stretch of garden and the deep blue sea beyond could both be seen. The afternoon light streamed into the room, casting warm golden bands across the wool blanket pulled over her. Wren sat beside the bed and took Eleanor's thin hand in hers. "You have done so well, Wren," Eleanor said, her voice light as wind, yet every word clear and full of feeling. "You gave my grandson something I never believed he would have, a real family." Wren felt tears rise into her eyes, but she tried to hold them back. "It was you who gave me everything," she said, her voice breaking. "You opened the door when no one else would. You saved me when I had nothing left." Eleanor smiled, her hand tightening gently around Wren's. "That was the only thing I knew how to do," she said slowly. "And now it is your turn." She looked into Wren's eyes, and the depth of her blue gaze held all the wisdom and love she had gathered across 78 years of life. "Always open the door for those who need shelter. Be a lighthouse for lost souls, and love my grandson, because even if he isn't good at showing it, he needs your love more than anyone." That night, Eleanor died in her sleep. She passed peacefully, a faint smile resting on her face as though she were dreaming of something beautiful. Perhaps she was dreaming of the garden flooded with sunlight, of the roses she had loved, of her husband waiting for her somewhere on the other side. The funeral was held 3 days later. The whole city came to pay their respects, familiar faces and strangers alike, people Eleanor had once helped and people who had known her only by reputation. Sterling stood there receiving condolences, his face cold as stone, not a single tear falling. But Wren knew. She knew that behind that outward stillness was a heart breaking apart. After the funeral, Sterling disappeared. He told no one where he was going, left no message, simply vanished as though he needed to sink into darkness to carry his grief alone. Wren didn't panic. She knew where he had gone. On the third day, she left the children in Pierce's care and drove to the Blackwell family cemetery on the hill overlooking the sea. She found him there, sitting between his father's grave, which had been there for 14 years now, and Eleanor's fresh grave still covered in funeral flowers. Sterling didn't turn when he heard her footsteps on the grass. He only sat there, his back straight as always, but his shoulders slumped in a way Wren had never seen before. She said nothing. She simply sat beside him, shoulder touching shoulder, and looked out at the sea changing color beneath the setting sun. They sat there in silence until the sky turned from orange to violet, from violet to black, and then from black to the pale gray of dawn. And somewhere in that long night, Wren saw something she had thought she never would. Tears, quietly slipping down Sterling's face, without sound, without sobbing, only those salt drops falling from steel blue eyes that had grown too tired from always having to be strong. Wren offered no comfort in words. She didn't say everything would be all right. She didn't offer the hollow phrases people speak at funerals. She only took his hand and let him know that she was here, and that she wasn't going anywhere. There are griefs that need no comfort in words, only the presence of someone who stays. They buried Eleanor at the top of the hill, beside the husband she had loved all her life. From there she could look out over the sea, look down upon the estate she had built, look toward the garden where her granddaughter would go on planting flowers. On the white marble headstone, there was only a single simple line, but it held everything Eleanor had ever been. She opened the door. 5 years passed, like a quiet river flowing through Blackwell Estate. Wren was no longer the ragged, trembling girl who had once stood before the iron gates. She had become Lady Blackwell, the woman who now ran the Blackwell Foundation and turned it into one of the largest charitable organizations on the East Coast of the United States. Under her hand, the foundation expanded its work, building dozens of shelters for women and children, funding scholarships for thousands of students from difficult circumstances, and becoming a lighthouse of hope for those wandering lost in the dark. Sterling was still the man the whole city feared. He was still cold in meetings, still made decisions no one dared question, still remained the darkness people whispered about at night. But at home, he was the father who carried his children to bed each night, the man who sat on the floor building puzzles with them, the husband who still stood watching his wife sleep every morning before leaving the room. 2 men living in one body, and Wren loved them both. Rosalie was 7 now, a bright and strong little girl with eyes that shone like stars, and a will of iron so fierce that everyone said she was exactly like Sterling, even though they didn't share blood. She had learned to read at 4, had been able to argue with adults by 6, and had already declared that one day she would take over the Blackwell Empire. Sterling never corrected her. He only nodded and said he would wait. Bennett was 5, gentle and quiet like his father, but with blue eyes that watched everything with startling sharpness. He spoke little, but when he did, every word was worth hearing. Eleanor had once said that he would become the most dangerous person in the family, not because he was fierce, but because he saw everything without anyone ever realizing he was looking. One evening, as the setting sun turned the whole garden gold, Pierce stepped into the drawing room where Wren was reading. "There is someone at the gate," he said, his voice neutral, but his eyes carried a message Wren understood immediately. Wren set the book down and went out to the gate. Through the gleaming black bars, she saw a young woman standing there. The girl was perhaps in her early 20s, dressed in worn, faded clothes, carrying a pregnancy of 7 or 8 months, her eyes red from crying. She looked like an injured sparrow, searching for shelter in the middle of a storm. "I am sorry," the girl stammered, her voice shaking. "I have nowhere to go. Someone told me this place might help me. I don't know if it is true, but I have nowhere else left." Wren looked at the girl, and in that moment she saw herself from 7 years ago. The ragged young woman standing at these same gates in the rain, with nothing but an old suitcase and a child in her womb. A woman who had lost everything and didn't know whether anyone would open the door for her. Wren smiled and pressed the button to open the gate. "Come in," she said softly, her voice warm as spring sunlight. "You are safe now." She led the girl into the house, asking nothing about her past, passing no judgment on her circumstances, setting no conditions on her help, just as Eleanor had once done for her 7 years earlier. The circle had closed. Upstairs, Sterling stood by the window, looking down at his wife as she led a strange young woman into the house. Pierce stood beside him, watching the scene with quiet familiarity. "Another one?" Pierce asked, his voice carrying one of those rare hints of humor. Sterling didn't turn, but the faintest smile touched his mouth, the kind only those closest to him would ever see. "My wife has rules of her own," he said slowly, "and I never stand in her way." Wren Blackwell had become the Eleanor of the next generation, the one who opened the door when no one else would, the lighthouse for lost souls, the shelter for those who had lost everything. The circle had closed, but the story would never truly end, because somewhere out there would always be people running from darkness, searching for a door that would open for them, and Blackwell Estate would always be here, waiting. And that is the story of the woman who stepped into the devil's territory and found heaven. A story about love growing in silence, about salvation coming from the last place anyone expected, and about the cycle of kindness passed from one generation to the next. If this story touched your heart, please tap the like button and share it so more people can hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Which character impressed you the most? Which moment moved you the deepest? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We always want to hear what lives in the deepest part of your heart, because those reflections are what inspire us to keep bringing you stories that are even more meaningful. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.